I'm Batman.
Get it? Batman? Masking? Well, I tried. In this lesson, we're going to talk about masking. Masking is absolutely essential when you want to composite multiple layers of video on top of each other. It essentially allows you to cut out or extract different parts of your layer, making the rest invisible so that bottom layers can show through. This allows you to create some really cool visual effects like the fabled cloning effect, where you have multiple copies of yourself roaming the screen. So let's jump into Adobe After Effects and get masking. Before we jump into Adobe After Effects, here's the final effect that we will be creating. Pretty cool and super easy to create using masks. In Adobe After Effects, I have a brand new project here, and the very first thing I want to do is import my source footage. In the course material under the video folder, you will find 3 clips called thieving clones 1, 2, 3. So let's select all of them by holding Ctrl on our keyboard and hit import. Let's drag thieving clones 1 onto the new composition icon to create a new composition. If you scrub through this clip, you will see that it's a video of the first Walter trying to eat his nacho chips and then pretending like someone already took them. Let's drag thieving clones 02 into the composition and place it on the top. And this is a video of the second clone, essentially grabbing the nacho chips, passing them on, and at the end again pretending like somebody stole them. Let's drag thieving clones 03 into the composition as well and drop it at the very top. And this is a video of the last clone, of the last Walter, essentially grabbing those nacho chips and being all happy. Now, what we need to do is we essentially need to combine these 3 layers and kind of cut out the pieces that we want and overlay them together so that it looks like one coherent clip with all 3 clones in it at once. This is exactly where masks come in. For now, let's disable the visibility on the top 2 layers so we really just see the first thieving clones or one layer, which is just has one clone in it. And in the toolbar at the top, about the middle, you'll find this little rectangle tool and a pen tool, and both of these ones allow you to draw masks. You'll see this little triangle icon at the bottom right, and if you click and hold, this will reveal rectangle tool, rounded, ellipse tool, star tool, so just different shapes for drawing your masks. And under the pen tool, this might vary a little bit depending on which version of After Effects you have, but you should always have a pen tool, add vertex tool, delete vertex tool, and the convert vertex tool. Mask feather tool, I think was in CS6 and above. Don't quote me on that, but that's a bit newer, but you should have most of the basic tools. For now, let's simply grab the rectangle tool, so click and hold, make sure you select the rectangle tool, and then do make sure that the layer you want to apply the mask to is selected, so select your thieving clones 01 layer, make sure it's visible in the preview window, and then simply click and drag to draw a rectangular mask around the piece of footage that you want to keep. This essentially now cut a rectangle out of this layer, and while everything around it looks black, what it actually is, if underneath the preview window you enable this little checkerboard, the transparency grid, you'll see that essentially we have only one layer in our composition, we've cut out a rectangle, and everything around it is essentially transparent. We've just cut this little square out. Now, I know this isn't getting us much closer to the final effect, but I just want to go over some of the basics first. So for now, let me disable the transparency grid, just because it's a little bit bright and shiny on my eyes. Just remember, everything black right now is essentially transparent. On the thieving clones layer, under the mask tab, you will now find a mask, mask 1, which is the rectangle that we just applied. You can pop this open and you'll find a number of properties that you can adjust. For one, you can change how this mask is actually being applied. Right now it's additive, it's adding content to this layer. If you click on this little drop down and for example change this to subtract, you're essentially now cutting the contents of this mask out of the layer. So you can combine different masks and cut pieces out or add pieces to it. You can draw multiple masks onto the same layer. So for example, what I could do is still with the rectangle tool, select it, and with my layer still selected, let's just draw another rectangle into this one here. And so now what we've done, we've got one mask which subtracts its content, and then inside that mask we have another mask which adds content back in. And again, this one has some properties that you can adjust. For example, masks have something called feather, and this is highly important when you want to create some visual effects. If we bring up the feather of this mask too, this inner mask, just push this up, you can see how the edges get nice and soft and blurry. And quite often when you're combining different video layers, you don't want harsh edges because it looks really unnatural. You kind of want to add a little bit of feathering to your masks, usually so the layers kind of blend together on the edges and this looks a whole lot more natural. You also have mask opacity, so you can control how much percentage of this mask is actually being applied. And you have something called mask expansion, and this essentially just lets you to push out or pull in the content area of this mask. So if I bring out this expansion, I'm including more and more around the mask. If I bring it in, I'm including less and less of what is defined by this mask. So again, it lets you control how exactly this mask affects your layer. Finally, you also have a mask path property, and this just has a shape defined, and we're going to be using this in a second. This essentially allows you to animate the actual shape of the mask. So right now, if you scrub through it, the masks are very static, but you can actually animate these masks to move around freely, kind of follow moving objects along. We'll be using that to cut out our clones nicely in a minute. So just know it's there. And all of these properties have a little stopwatch icon on the left-hand side, meaning you can animate every single one of them. Let's select mask 2, press delete to delete it, select mask 1, press delete to delete that too. So we're back to our base footage, and let's start creating the actual visual effect. Let's enable thieving clones 2, so let's bring the visibility of that one back. And obviously, because this layer covers up everything underneath it, we can't see the video layer underneath it anymore. But let's use a mask to essentially cut this clone out of the video. So you can essentially click and drag a rectangle around this Walter clone, and we now may want to adjust this mask. Right now, we're still on the mask tool, so you can't actually drag the edges. In order to adjust the shape of your mask, you can press V to return to selection mode, and then double click on the mask itself. And this might be a bit tricky if you can't hit the edge exactly. And then you can bring in the edges here, or if you're around the corners, you can click and drag to rotate your mask around as well. So you can kind of try to align this mask a little bit nicer, so it only covers the second clone. So what is essentially happening? Let's solo the Thieves Clones 2 layer. That's really just this section of the layer. It's just the second copy of Walter sitting here. And everything around it, again, remember, is transparent. So the bottom layer, let's disable the solo switch again. The bottom layer, Thieving Clones 1, is showing through everywhere else. Now, one thing you can notice quite clearly is that as I filmed those clips, the light has changed slightly. So you can see this really harsh edge of the mask. And this is where mask feathering becomes so important. Let's pop open the properties for mask 1 on Thieving Clones 2, and let's just bring up the mask feather a little bit. And what's going to happen is that that edge, that harsh edge, almost vanishes because it blurs between those two layers. And that looks a whole lot more natural already. Let's scrub through and just check this out. Obviously, well, right now it's kind of weird that Walter has a nacho chips bag, but there's already another one lying on the ground. And what's going to happen is right here, Walter essentially places that bag on the ground, but this is where kind of these layers overlap, because our Thieving Clones 2 layer is now covering up the one underneath. So you're getting this really strange effect of the first Walter is essentially reaching underneath the layer of the second clone. So that doesn't quite work for us. Also, what I can see, if I zoom in a little bit, there's a little bit of that nacho bag left because of the feathering on our mask. So let's solve this slightly differently and just a little bit more clever. Let's delete mask 1 again. Let's come back to right here. So right here, we need to assume that this nacho bag isn't actually there yet until the first clone actually places that bag on the ground. I hope you're following this. If not, just, rewind a little bit, play this back again. So what I want to do is I essentially, at this point, only want to have this clone cut out, not the nacho bag. But then, after the first clone places the bag on the ground, I'm going to expand this mask to include the bag on the ground, and then the second Walter can essentially pick it up. If that sounded complicated, don't worry, it's actually not that bad. What I'm going to do now, I'm going to come up into my toolbar, but rather than using the rectangle tool, which is just a little bit static, let's grab the pen tool, and the pen tool allows you to draw a free mask shape. So now what I can do, first off, do make sure that your Thieving Clones 2 layer is selected, and now I can click and move, and click again, move and click, and draw a path around this clone, but I'm going to exclude this nacho bag. Make sure that you close the mask path by clicking on the first point that you created. If the mask is not closed, it will not actually be applied. Now, if you're not quite happy with the shape of the mask, again, press V to return to selection mode. You can click and drag around individual points. So at the foot, for example, I can see a little bit of the shadow of this nacho back here. So I'm going to drag this in a little bit because I don't want too much of that. I'm going to bring this point down so we're getting this nice smooth edge down here. Probably don't need that much space around the foot either. So that's actually looking all right. If you want to move the mask, simply double click on an edge and then you can drag the whole mask around. But I'm going to Control Z that because I don't actually want to do that. If you want to return back to point selection mode, because right now I can't select the points anymore, simply hit Escape, click outside of the mask, and now again you can kind of click and drag these points around. It takes a little bit getting used to, but it's not that complicated once you got the hang of it. Let's zoom in a little bit, come down here, and again, the edge is a little bit too harsh for me, so I'm going to open up my Mask 1 properties and just bring a little bit of feathering into it. Don't want to push too much, just enough to make this edge, this visible edge, disappear. Let's zoom out. So that looks all right. Now, I might want to kind of bring this point in because I can see the shadow is being cut off just a little bit. I kind of do want the shadow to be moving across the first clone. Just looks a little bit more natural that way, so we're not blocking out the shadow here. So clone 1 sits down. Clone 1 now places the back. And again here, I may want to adjust this mask just a little bit so I can see the whole nacho back being placed on the ground. Right here. Now what I need to do is I need to cut over this clone to essentially include this nacho back, because what's going to happen is that this clone now reaches down to grab the nacho back and pull it out. But we're still being covered up by this layer. We're being cut off because it's not included in the masks. So what I want to do is right here, as I'm reaching down, I want to animate this mask to essentially expand and include this nacho back at the bottom. So let's leave this point right there, zoom in a little bit, and now let's animate the actual mask path. Also, I'm noticing the foot is a little bit transparent here, so let's just fix all of that up by just animating this mask path properly. So on Mask 1, on Theming Clones 2, enable the stopwatch icon on the mask path property, and I'm going to bring these ones out a little bit. And again, if you're moving the entire mask around, let's undo that. Click outside of the mask somewhere first, and now I can move the points individually. And this has created a keyframe for the mask path. Let's go back a little bit. This is where it's happening. I'm moving the foot, so what I want to do is right here, again, click outside the mask. Let's bring these points in a little bit. So essentially the mask will now animate to follow my foot. And now I need to make this mask follow my hand as well. So let's move to where the hand is fully covered. And let's just move these ones down and over the nacho back to maybe about there. And what's going to happen is this mask path is now going to reshape between these keyframes. So as this arm comes down and grabs it, we're cutting over to the other layer. So now if you zoom out, rewind a little bit and play this section back, it looks like the second clone is stealing the nachos from the first clone. And what I'm noticing right here, where we're placing the nacho back, the hand is being blurred out and cut off a little bit. So again, select that layer and let's just push this mask out just a little bit more so we make sure we know where we're placing it. Right there. Cool, so we now have the first half of this effect completed. Clone number 2 is stealing the nacho back of clone number 1. Now let's collapse this layer, enable the visibility on our Thieving Clones 3, and again, everything vanishes because this layer will cover up everything that sits beneath it. And that's a video of clone number 3 coming in and snatching off that nacho back. So again, let's apply a mask to this layer to essentially just cut out this clone here as he's stealing that nacho back away. For that, make sure Thieving Clone number 3 is selected. Grab the pen tool, move out just a little bit. And by the way, to move my preview window around, I'm just holding down space on my keyboard and dragging. So let's draw a mask around this clone. Just include a little bit. We're going to have to animate this mask anyways, but I do want to make sure I've got everything of this clone in this mask. So now what we should have clone number 3 come in. And of course, we're going to have to fix up where the clone reaches for the nacho back. And the foot here is being cut off as well. I'm also going to just move these mask points over a little bit, so make sure at least I'm getting his entire head in. So, and then he just grabs the back and stands on the side. So that looks all right. Again, we're having a pretty harsh edge on the mask itself here. The foot is being cut off a little bit. I'm actually going to align these points kind of with the edge of the kitchen floor, just because it usually looks a little bit more natural if your masks follow more natural lines. And I'm going to actually drag these points here to be aligned with the corner of the kitchen. It usually just ends up looking a little bit more natural. So that looks all right. Let's select Thieving Clones Layer 3. And you can either open up this twirly here to get to the masks. You can also just press M on your keyboard to reveal all of the masks, which is much easier, or MM if you want to expand all of the masks and their properties on this layer. And let's just bring up the mask feather just a little bit to just kind of blur out these edges a little. And again, we can see that we're kind of cutting off the foot here. So let's just bring that in a little bit, because right now we don't need that much. So that looks all right. But again, let's animate the mask path to make this whole thing happen. Let's enable the stopwatch icon for the mask path. Let me just make this a little bit bigger. And let's start scrubbing through. And right here, I can see his foot vanishes. So let's bring these, again, if you move the whole mask, Control Z, click somewhere outside of the mask, and let's drag these points over just a little bit. So I do get his entire foot in. And again, you may have to adjust this a little bit, kind of move about to make this look as natural as you can. So that looks all right. And at this point, I think I can probably move these points back again. So that's the foot fixed up. And I think that works okay. Let's fix up the hand. And we're going to do exactly the same thing. At this point, just as we're about to reach right here, as we're about to reach for the nacho bag, let's just make sure we're including the entire hand. And at this point, I want to make sure that this mask includes the entire nacho bag. And what has happened here is, as we defined keyframes to deal with the foot, we've actually keyframed the entire shape of the mask. So now it's already reverting, it's already moving about. Not quite what I wanted, so let's zoom in here on the timeline. And I can actually do this at the top here in the timeline. I've got this little zoom bar. So if I just bring this in, I can kind of expand this out, and I can see the keyframes here a little bit more clearly. So what I want to do is here, let's move to the next keyframe. And on your keyboard, you can actually use J to jump to the previous keyframe and K to jump to the next one. It's actually really useful. So from this keyframe still looks okay. Let's press K to jump to the next keyframe. And that looks a bit wonky. So let's fix this up to make sure we've got all of the nachos selected and the hand is visible as it's grabbing it. So let's make sure that looks okay. That does look okay. Let's press K again. That looks okay as well. Press K again. And that looks wrong because the mask contracts again. So we're seeing the original copy of that nacho bag. What I want to do is at this keyframe point, I want to make sure that the mask again just covers up this nacho bag no longer being there. Press K again. And we may have to fix this up one more time. So this is just really getting your mask to animate properly. And as you animate one part, the entire mask path is going to get keyframed, so you're going to have to fix that up along the way. So now we've got the clone reaching for that nacho bag and stealing it, and it is pretty much permanently gone. So now let's zoom all the way out by pressing Alt and /, collapse all layers, rewind. You can also hold down Alt and scroll with your mouse wheel while in the timeline and zoom in and out. And let's play back the final effect. Cool, that's the first clone. And let's steal that nacho bag. That is looking pretty good. And let's wait for the next clone to come in and complete the steal. Cool. And with that, we've used masks to create a really cool looking clone interacting effect in Adobe After Effects. And this is not actually a simple feat, but just know that masks are at the core of almost all visual effects in one way or another, and you can create some really cool stuff with them. The last thing I want to touch on, because I know it does confuse a whole lot of people, let's disable the visibility of the top two layers. We just have this base footage, but I really just want to go over a very basic principle for masks. If you use the pen tool and you don't have a layer selected, so right now I have no layer selected, if I now click and start drawing something, I'm not creating a mask. What I'm creating is a shape layer, and we're going to get to them in another lesson, but just make sure that, let's delete this layer again, this shape layer that got created. Make sure that before you draw your mask, you have the layer selected that you want to apply the mask to, otherwise this is not going to work. So I can now draw a mask and it actually gets applied to this layer. Let's delete the mask again, and the other option you have as well, rather than just clicking to create points, you can actually click, hold and drag to create bezier points. So you can create rounded edges for your mask. So you can kind of create these as well. If you just click, basically you create a single point. If you click and drag, you create these nice round edges. Let's close this off. And the cool thing with these edges, if you select one of those points, you'll see these bezier handles. You can adjust them in any way you want to kind of just give your edges really nice soft corners. And again, you can animate all of this stuff as well. However, if you accidentally created a bezier point and you want it to be a boring, simple linear one instead, you can, with pen tools still selected, Alt or Option click onto the point to convert it to or from a bezier point. So this is just one way you can customize your mask, and it does confuse people when they don't know about it, but it's just one of those really simple things that you can do with masks. You just need to know how to control it when you need to. Let's delete the mask again, collapse everything, re-enable the visibility of all of our layers, so we're back to our final clone effect. Hopefully this gave you a good idea of all the cool stuff that you can do with masking. They're really essential to almost any visual effect, and you can create some really great visual trickery by doing nothing but combining a few video layers, applying some masks, and animating them intelligently.